The petition had been denied for the third time in as many years. David Walsh stared at the holographic display showing the vote count, watching the red rejection markers far outnumber the few scattered green approvals. 73 years since first contact, and humanity was still treated like dangerous animals that needed to be kept in a cage. Around the assembly chamber, representatives from 200 species chittered, clicked, and vocalized their satisfaction. The insectoid High Arbiter Quilvin raised multiple limbs in a gesture of finality. David knew what was coming next. The speech about safety protocols, the reminder that Earth was a Class 12 death world, the patronizing tone that suggested humans should be grateful they were allowed to exist at all. Priya Sharma sat in the observation gallery above, her fingers gripping the railing hard enough to hurt. She had spent 5 years studying galactic biology, learning everything about the species that made up the assembly. What she had discovered made her sick. Humans were physically superior to nearly every species in the chamber below, stronger, faster, more adaptable. But those same traits had been used to justify keeping humanity in chains. The restrictions were suffocating. Humans needed permits to leave their solar system. Their military was limited to 12 outdated patrol ships. Population growth was monitored and controlled. Any human caught with unauthorized technology faced imprisonment or worse. The assembly called it protection. David called it slavery with extra steps. Commissioner Brell approached the human delegation section, his aquatic environment suit making wet sounds as he moved. His translated voice carried across the chamber with artificial cheerfulness. Humanity's request for basic defensive rights on their mining colonies was unreasonable, he explained. Dangerous species could not be trusted with weapons. The recent incident at Station 47 was unfortunate, but acceptable given the risks of employing humans in hazardous environments. Acceptable. 23. Miners dead because station security had decided target. Practice was more entertaining than protecting workers. The footage showed humans begging for help while alien overseers laughed. The assembly had watched the evidence and shrugged. Just deathworlders dying. Nothing important, David wanted to scream. He wanted to flip the desk and show them exactly why they should fear humans. But that would only prove their point. Instead, he stood and asked for permission to speak. Quilvin granted it with obvious reluctance. His words were measured and careful. He spoke about the human workers who died in jobs too dangerous for other species. He mentioned the colonies that begged for protection from raiders. He reminded them that humanity had followed every rule, obeyed every restriction, and asked for nothing but basic dignity. His voice never rose above a conversational tone, but everyone in the chamber could hear the barely contained anger beneath. The response was predictable. Several representatives objected to his tone. Others suggested that humans were becoming aggressive and might need additional restrictions. One even proposed limiting human reproduction further to reduce future security risks. The vote was called quickly. More restrictions passed with overwhelming support. Roy Foster watched the proceedings from his ship in orbit around Earth. As commander of humanity's pathetic excuse for a defense fleet, he felt the humiliation deeply. 12 ships to protect an entire species. 12 ships that were slower and weaker than anything the assembly fielded. He had been ordered to stand down from responding to the Station 47 massacre. Earth's government still believed diplomacy could work. His crew did not share that belief. Lieutenant Sophie Grant had survived Station 47 by hiding in a ventilation shaft for 6 hours while her friends were murdered. She sat at the weapons console now, her hands trembling with rage. She had submitted her report with video evidence. The assembly had called it propaganda. Below them, Earth continued its careful dance of compliance. Factories produced goods that were shipped across the galaxy. Human workers left their families to take dangerous jobs on alien worlds. Children were taught to be respectful of their galactic neighbors. Everyone pretended this was normal. Everyone acted like being second-class citizens in their own galaxy was acceptable. But something was changing. Priya had noticed it in her research. Humans across dozens of colonies were communicating through coded messages. Small acts of defiance were becoming more common. Workers were organizing in ways that looked innocent but created networks. Someone was planning something. She had suspected for months but confirmed it last week. Dr. James Park, a weapons researcher supposedly working on mining equipment, had let something slip during a tired conversation. Humanity had not been idle during 73 years of restrictions. In basements and hidden facilities, humans had been preparing, not for peace. For the moment when peace became impossible. That moment felt very close now. David returned from the assembly chamber looking 10 years older. The additional restrictions would take effect immediately. Human ships would need escorts even within their own solar system. Random inspections of human facilities could occur without warning. Failure to comply would result in immediate military intervention. Priya met him in the corridor outside the human delegation offices. She said nothing, just handed him a data pad. On it was a message that had been circulating through underground channels. It was simple and direct. How much longer would they wait? How many more had to die? When would humanity remember what it meant to be human? David read it twice, then looked at Priya with tired eyes. He had spent decades believing in diplomacy. He had convinced himself that patience would win respect. But the assembly had made their position clear. Humans were tools to be used and discarded. Nothing would change that. He asked Priya a question that would haunt him later. If it came to war, could humanity win? She did not hesitate. Against any single species, absolutely. Against the entire assembly, probably not. But winning was not the point anymore. The point was refusing to die quietly. That night, messages flowed across human networks like electricity through wire. In orbit, Roy Foster received new orders that did not come from Earth's government. On distant colonies, humans began moving weapons and supplies to hidden locations. And on 47 stations and outposts scattered across multiple sectors, people who had been treated as expendable began preparing to show the galaxy exactly what Deathworlders could do when pushed too far. 3 weeks after the vote, assembly inspection teams arrived at the Mars colony without warning. They came in force, 20 military vessels surrounding the settlement of 30,000 humans. The colony administrator tried to protest the lack of notice, but the lead inspector simply pushed past her into the administrative building. Sophie Grant was visiting family on Mars when the inspections began. She watched from her sister's apartment as armed assembly troops moved through the streets, demanding entry into homes and businesses. They were searching for unauthorized weapons, they claimed. Evidence suggested the Mars colony was stockpiling equipment in violation of protocols. The evidence was fabricated, but that did not matter. The inspection teams tore through the colony like a storm. They destroyed property, harassed civilians, and treated every human as a criminal. When a group of young men objected to soldiers entering their homes without cause, the situation escalated quickly. Nobody was certain who moved first. The soldiers claimed the humans attacked them. Survivors insisted the troops opened fire without provocation. Either way, the result was the same. 200 civilians lay dead in the streets of Mars colony before the sun set on that terrible day. Sophie had been in combat before. She had military training and knew how to handle violence. But watching children bleeding on pavement while assembly soldiers prevented medical teams from helping was different. This was not war. This was murder. And the soldiers were laughing about it. She pulled 3 injured kids into a building and used emergency supplies to stabilize them. Around her, other humans were doing the same. They worked quickly, knowing the soldiers might decide to finish what they started. When the troops finally withdrew, they left behind a colony in shock and mourning. Earth's government issued a formal complaint. The assembly reviewed the incident and determined the inspection team had acted appropriately. The deaths were regrettable but necessary to maintain security. Commissioner Brell appeared on broadcast suggesting that humans should teach their children to comply with authority. Roy Foster received the news while his fleet conducted routine patrols near Jupiter. His orders from Earth were clear. Stand down. Do not respond. Allow the diplomatic process to work. He read those orders 3 times, then deleted them from his console. His crew watched him in silence. They all knew people who had died on Mars. They had all reached the same breaking point. When Roy opened a communication channel to the other 11 ships in humanity's fleet, every captain answered immediately. The brief conversation was not recorded, but the result was unmistakable. The human defense fleet went dark, shutting off all tracking systems and disappearing into the asteroid belt. On Earth, David Walsh sat in an emergency government meeting while officials debated their response. Some wanted to court-martial Roy and his officers. Others insisted they had to maintain the moral high ground. The argument went in circles for hours while David said nothing. Finally, the defense minister asked him directly what humanity should do. David looked around the table at faces trying to pretend they still had options. Then he told them the truth. Mars had changed everything. The underground networks were ready. The hidden weapons were in place. And humanity was out of patience. The government could either lead or get out of the way. But the response was coming regardless of what they decided. The only question was whether Earth would support its people or abandon them. Priya had the numbers. She had been tracking human positions across the galaxy for months. There were 47 locations where humans had sufficient numbers and resources to act. Mining stations, construction platforms, agricultural settlements, places where humans did the dangerous work that other species refused to do. James Park had the weapons. Decades of secret research had produced equipment that looked like mining tools or construction equipment, but could be modified in minutes. Nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. Just effective tools designed by people who understood violence. The coordination was impressive. Across multiple sectors, humans synchronized their actions to within a 30-minute window. Assembly forces monitoring human facilities noticed nothing unusual until it was far too late. The uprising began simultaneously in 47 locations. Workers who had been treated as disposable revealed themselves as soldiers. Equipment that had seemed innocent became weapons, and Deathworlders who had been forced to hold back finally showed what they could do. At Station 93, 300 humans seized control from 3,000 assembly peacekeepers in under 2 hours. The peacekeepers had better weapons and numerical advantage. What they did not have was experience fighting an enemy that could take damage and keep coming. Humans attacked with a ferocity that shocked their opponents. They used the station's industrial equipment as weapons. They moved through spaces too dangerous for other species. They adapted to setbacks instantly. The Battle of Europa Station became legendary within days. Sophie Grant led a team of 70 volunteers against an assembly garrison of over 1,000. She had survived Mars. She had watched children die. And she had nothing left but rage and determination. Her tactics were brutal and effective. She used the station's gravity systems against the defenders. She vented sections into space and then survived in vacuum longer than the aliens expected. She turned their own weapons against them by understanding their technology better than they did. When the battle ended, the assembly forces had surrendered or fled. Sophie's team had taken 60 casualties but held the station. Similar stories played out across the galaxy. Humans who had been miners became warriors. Construction workers became tactical geniuses. People who had been told they were dangerous proved it in ways the assembly had never imagined. The assembly's response was swift and harsh. High Arbiter Quilvin declared humanity a rogue species. The restrictions were over. Now it was extermination. Every human facility was to be neutralized. Every human ship was to be destroyed. The Deathworlders had revealed their true nature, and the galaxy would be safer without them. But declaring war and winning it were different things. The assembly had numerical superiority and better technology. What they lacked was the willingness to die that humans possessed. Every battle cost them more than expected. Every victory was Pyrrhic, and humans kept learning, kept adapting, kept coming. Roy Foster brought his fleet out of hiding at the Battle of Callisto, 12 outdated ships against an assembly task force of 50 modern warships. The outcome should have been obvious. Instead, Roy used tactics that no sane commander would attempt. He flew through radiation fields that would kill most species. He used Jupiter's gravity well in ways that violated every safety protocol. He sacrificed 2 ships to destroy 15 enemy vessels. When the battle ended, the assembly task force retreated. Roy had lost a third of his fleet. But he had proven something important. Humans could win, and once that became clear, everything changed. Across the galaxy, species that had quietly resented assembly control began watching with new interest. If Deathworlders could fight back successfully, maybe others could too. The uprising that began as a human rebellion started spreading into something much larger. And the assembly realized too late that they had created their own nightmare by pushing humanity past the breaking point. Ambassador Kelran had represented his people at the Galactic Assembly for 20 years. In all that time, he had watched the Sorrow species follow orders, pay tribute, and accept limitations on their sovereignty. His reptilian features made emotions difficult for other species to read, which had been useful for hiding his growing resentment. The human uprising changed everything. Kelran watched the battle reports and saw something his people had forgotten. Defiance was possible. The assembly was not invincible, and species that had been pushed down could stand back up if they found the courage. He made contact with David Walsh through unofficial channels. The conversation was brief and dangerous for both of them. Kelron offered industrial support and safe harbor for human refugees. In return, he asked for one thing. When the war was over, remember that not all species supported humanity's oppression. David accepted immediately. The Free Worlds Alliance was born from that conversation. Within weeks, 3 species had formally broken from the assembly to support humanity. Dozens more provided quiet assistance while maintaining official neutrality. The Saros brought industrial capacity that humanity desperately needed. Their manufacturing worlds could produce ships and weapons faster than Earth's damaged economy. But more importantly, they brought legitimacy. This was no longer just rogue Deathworlders. This was a coalition fighting for basic rights. War Chief Rana led the Korgath warrior clans, a species that had been relegated to serving as mercenaries for the assembly. They were powerful fighters, but had been kept in check through economic control and political isolation. Rana had grown tired of being treated as a weapon to be aimed at assembly enemies. When news of the human rebellion reached Korgath space, Rana did something unprecedented. She unified the competing clans under a single banner and offered their military strength to the Free Worlds Alliance. Her reasoning was simple and brutal. Humans fought like Korgath warriors but with better tactics. Fighting alongside them would bring honor. Fighting against them would bring death. The Assembly's response was to declare total war. Lord Executor Van took command of the military forces with orders to crush the rebellion quickly. He was the Assembly's best strategist, responsible for putting down 3 previous uprisings by other species. He studied the human tactics and determined they relied on unpredictability and willingness to accept casualties. His strategy was to overwhelm them with superior numbers and technology. For every human facility, send 10 times the necessary force. For every human ship, dedicate an entire task force. Grind them down through attrition until they were forced to surrender or die. It was a sound strategy against any normal opponent. But humans were not normal, and neither were their new allies. Patricia Chen had been an admiral before the restrictions reduced humanity's military to nothing. She had spent decades training officers in theory, since they were forbidden from practicing in reality. When Roy Foster asked her to take command of the growing rebel fleet, she accepted on one condition: no more defensive thinking. If the Assembly wanted war, humans would bring war to their core worlds. Her first major operation targeted the Nebula Gate, a critical supply route connecting 12 assembly sectors. The gate itself was protected by extensive fortifications and a fleet of 200 warships. Patricia brought 70 ships from 3 species and attacked it anyway. The Battle of Nebula Gate lasted 6 hours. Patricia used every trick humanity had developed during their restricted years. She split her forces and attacked from multiple angles. She used drones and decoys to confuse enemy sensors. She coordinated with Korgath boarding teams who fought with savage efficiency. And when the Assembly committed their reserves to defend the gate, she destroyed the supply depots on the other side instead. The gate survived, but the Assembly lost 3 months of accumulated supplies. More importantly, they lost the aura of invincibility. If humans could strike deep into assembly space, nowhere was safe. The war spread like infection across the galaxy. 14 sectors descended into chaos as species chose sides or tried desperately to remain neutral. Trade routes collapsed. Communication networks fragmented, and casualty counts climbed into the billions as the conflict escalated beyond anyone's control. Priya found herself analyzing alien biology for military purposes now. Her research into species' weaknesses became tactical intelligence. She hated it but recognized the necessity. The Assembly had started this war by treating humans as expendable. Ending it required using every advantage humanity possessed. She discovered something troubling in her analysis. The Assembly leadership had been manipulating member species for centuries. They used economic dependency, military threats, and political isolation to maintain control. The restrictions on humanity were just the most visible example of a system designed to keep everyone weak and compliant. When she shared this information with David, he immediately saw the opportunity. The war was not just about human freedom anymore. It was about exposing the Assembly's corruption and offering an alternative. Every species they liberated became another ally. Every secret they revealed turned more species against the assembly. David's broadcasts to neutral systems were powerful and effective. He did not ask for support. He simply told the truth about how the assembly operated. He showed the evidence of systematic exploitation. And he offered a vision of what the galaxy could be if species worked together as equals instead of masters and servants. Some species dismissed it as propaganda, but others recognized their own experiences in his words. The assembly had been taking advantage of everyone, just in different ways. And once that became clear, the coalition grew stronger. The siege of Titan became a turning point. The assembly sent its largest fleet to retake humanity's industrial facilities in the outer solar system. 3,000 ships under Lord Executor Van's personal command. They jumped into the system expecting to find a few hundred defenders. Instead, they found a trap. Patricia had spent weeks preparing the battlefield. The asteroid field was filled with mines that looked like rocks. Saturn's rings hid weapons platforms, and Titan itself had been turned into a fortress. The assembly fleet walked into a meat grinder. Human ships hit them from unexpected angles. Korgath fighters boarded their capital ships and carved through crews. Saros bombers targeted command vessels with precision strikes. And every time Van adapted his tactics, the humans changed theirs faster. The battle lasted 3 days and ended with the destruction of 70% of the assembly's fleet. Van escaped with his remaining forces, but his reputation as an invincible commander died at Titan. The assembly could no longer claim they were winning, but victory came at a terrible cost. Titan was left a burning ruin. Thousands of human defenders died holding the line. Roy Foster was killed when his ship rammed an assembly dreadnought to save a medical transport. His sacrifice bought time for civilians to evacuate, but it left humanity without one of its best commanders. Sophie Grant watched Roy's ship explode from her position on Titan's surface. She had served under him since the beginning. He had been the one who taught her that fighting back was possible. Now he was gone, another name on a list that grew longer every day. She wondered if any of this was worth it. They were winning battles but losing people. The galaxy was burning, and even if humanity survived, the scars would last generations. But surrender was not an option. The assembly had made that clear when they murdered 200 people on Mars. This war would end with freedom or extinction. There was no middle ground left. General Marcus Stone had never wanted to be famous. Before the war, he had been a construction supervisor on Europa, managing teams that built habitats in impossible conditions. Now he commanded ground forces that fought across 20 planets simultaneously. His troops called him the Hammer, and assembly forces had learned to fear that name. The war had evolved into something monstrous. 40% of the known galaxy was actively engaged in combat. The rest tried desperately to maintain neutrality while their economies collapsed from disrupted trade. Billions had died already, and the fighting showed no signs of stopping. The assembly attempted biological warfare 3 months after Titan. Their scientists developed a virus specifically designed to target human physiology. It was supposed to be fast-acting and lethal, rendering humanity extinct within weeks. They deployed it on 7 human colonies simultaneously, expecting quick results. Instead, they got a nightmare. Dr. Yuki Tanaka led the medical response team that analyzed the virus. She worked for 70 hours straight, pushing her deathworlder endurance to its limits. What she discovered changed the trajectory of the war. The virus was deadly, but human immune systems were adapting faster than the assembly expected. People were dying, but some were surviving, and those survivors carried antibodies that could be synthesized into a vaccine. Within 4 weeks, humanity had not only countered the biological attack, but had learned enough about assembly biology to develop their own weapons. Yuki refused to authorize biological warfare against civilian populations. She had watched the virus kill children and would not become what the assembly was. But she provided the military with non-lethal biological agents that could incapacitate enemy soldiers without permanent harm. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody but prevented escalation into mutual genocide. The assembly's failure with biological weapons revealed a deeper problem. Humans were adapting to everything thrown at them. Their engineers reverse-engineered captured technology and improved it within months. Their tacticians learned from every battle and developed new strategies constantly. And their soldiers seemed incapable of giving up no matter how desperate the situation became. Fleet Commander Oren had commanded assembly forces for 30 years and never lost a major engagement. He studied human tactics extensively and developed a strategy he believed would work. Humans relied on unpredictability and aggression. Counter that with patience and overwhelming force at decisive points. He chose the Forge system as his testing ground. It was a major industrial center for the Free Worlds Alliance, protected by significant defenses. Oren brought 500 ships and laid siege to the system, establishing a blockade and preparing for a methodical campaign of attrition. Patricia Chen responded by doing exactly what Oren expected. She attacked his blockade with insufficient forces, taking heavy losses. Oren smiled and reinforced his position. The humans were being predictable for once. He would bleed them dry and break their industrial capacity. 3 weeks into the siege, Oren discovered his mistake. The attacks had not been desperate attempts to break the blockade. They had been distractions. While he focused on defending against frontal assaults, human special forces had infiltrated his supply lines. They planted explosives on munition depots. They sabotaged fuel storage. They corrupted navigation systems. When Patricia launched her real attack, Oren's fleet found itself cut off from resupply and dealing with internal sabotage. The battle that followed was chaos. Human ships struck from every direction while Oren's forces struggled with compromised systems. The blockade collapsed in under 6 hours. Oren escaped with less than a third of his fleet. The defeat shocked the assembly. Their best commander had been outmaneuvered by Deathworlders who were supposed to be unsophisticated brutes. High Arbiter Quilven called an emergency session and demanded explanations. None were satisfactory. Mother Superior Alith watched the war from her species' neutral territory with growing concern. The Watchers had observed galactic events for millennia without interfering. They prided themselves on understanding long-term consequences. And Alith could see clearly where this war was heading. Everyone would lose. The Assembly would be destroyed, but the Free Worlds Alliance would be left ruling a galaxy full of ruins and resentment. Billions were already dead. Billions more would die before the fighting ended, and the hatred being generated would poison galactic politics for generations. She sent diplomatic envoys to both sides, proposing peace negotiations. The Assembly rejected them immediately. They had started this war to maintain control and could not accept defeat. The Free Worlds Alliance was more receptive, but their conditions for peace were non-negotiable. Full sovereignty for all species, dismantling of the Assembly power structure, justice for war crimes. Quilven would never accept those terms. The war continued. Marcus Stone led the assault on Prime Station, one of the Assembly's core military facilities. His troops numbered 40,000 against a garrison of 150,000. He had armor support and air superiority, but the defenders had fortifications that had never been breached. The battle lasted 16 days. Marcus used tactics that horrified even his own side. He sent berserker units into fortified positions knowing most would not return. He used human endurance to maintain constant pressure, while enemy troops exhausted themselves. He accepted casualties that would have broken any other species because humans just kept coming. When Prime Station fell, the victory was absolute but hollow. Marcus had lost half his forces. The facility was so damaged it would take years to rebuild, and the Assembly defenders had fought with desperate courage that earned his respect even as he killed them. He found one of the enemy commanders dying in the wreckage. The alien looked at him with compound eyes full of pain and asked why humans fought so hard. Marcus thought about lying, about giving some noble reason. Instead, he told the truth. Because the Assembly left them no choice. Because being pushed down eventually makes you stand up. Because once you start fighting for freedom, stopping means accepting slavery. The commander died without responding, and Marcus added another face to the nightmares that woke him screaming. David Walsh received daily casualty reports and felt the weight of every death. 2 billion humans had died so far. The number included Roy Foster, who had become a symbol of resistance. It included civilians who had been caught in battles. It included soldiers who had fought with courage and determination. But it also included Assembly personnel who had been following orders. Families who had been caught in human attacks. Civilians who had wanted nothing to do with the war. David had authorized actions that killed innocents because winning required ruthlessness. He wondered if they had become what they were fighting against. The Assembly had oppressed humanity, but humans had burned worlds and killed billions in response. Victory was coming closer every day, but at what cost? And what kind of galaxy would be left when the fighting finally ended? Priya brought him evidence that changed the calculation. She had found proof that the Assembly leadership had been planning human extermination for decades. The restrictions had not been about safety. They had been about keeping humanity weak until the Assembly could eliminate them entirely. Mars had not been an accident or escalation. It had been the beginning of genocide. The war was not just about freedom anymore. It was about survival. And that knowledge made the terrible decision slightly easier to bear. David authorized the next wave of attacks, knowing that stopping meant extinction. The galaxy would burn, but humanity would survive. That had to be enough. The Assembly's core worlds had never experienced war directly. For centuries, they had sent their fleets to fight in distant sectors while their populations enjoyed peace and prosperity. That safety ended when Patricia Chen brought the Free Worlds Alliance fleet to their doorstep. 12 species lived in the core sector, their homeworlds clustered around ancient trade routes. These were the founding members of the Assembly, the species that had built the power structure that oppressed everyone else. Their military defenses were extensive but had never been tested against a determined assault. Patricia brought 2,000 ships representing 9 different species. The coalition had grown far beyond its human origins. Dozens of species had joined after seeing evidence of Assembly corruption. They came seeking justice, revenge, or simply freedom from a system that had exploited them for too long. The siege began with ultimatums that everyone knew would be rejected. Surrender unconditionally, face trial for war crimes. Accept the dissolution of the Assembly government. High Arbiter Quilvin's response was broadcast across the galaxy. The Assembly would never surrender to rebellious primitives. Every core world would fight to the last citizen before accepting defeat. Quilvin meant it. As coalition forces advanced through the core sector, they encountered resistance that made previous battles seem merciful by comparison. Assembly defenders used scorched earth tactics, destroying their own infrastructure rather than letting it fall into enemy hands. They armed civilians and sent them into combat. They used weapons that violated every treaty and convention. The Battle of Assembly Prime was the worst. The planet held 8 billion inhabitants and was defended by the last major Assembly fleet. Patricia surrounded the world and demanded surrender. The defenders responded by launching attacks against coalition ships while using the civilian population as shields. Sophie Grant led one of the assault teams that fought through the planetary defenses. She had survived 3 years of war and had become something she barely recognized: hard, cold, efficient at killing. The idealistic lieutenant who had hidden during the Station 47 massacre was gone, replaced by someone who did what was necessary without hesitation. Her team fought through the capital city while buildings burned around them. Enemy soldiers used schools and hospitals as firing positions. Civilians caught in the crossfire died by the thousands. Sophie tried to minimize casualties but knew that every minute of delay meant more coalition soldiers dead. She found herself in a school basement with a group of alien children huddled in terror. Her training said to clear the building and move on. Her humanity said something different. She pulled 2 soldiers aside and ordered them to escort the children to safety. The soldiers argued it was not their mission. Sophie made it clear she did not care about the mission more than she cared about kids dying. That decision saved 30 children and cost 3 coalition soldiers their lives when the delay allowed enemy reinforcements to arrive. Sophie wondered if she had made the right choice. War did not allow for right choices anymore, only terrible ones. Marcus Stone coordinated ground forces across 7 core worlds simultaneously. His troops were exhausted, traumatized, and running low on supplies. But they kept fighting because stopping meant all the previous deaths had been meaningless. The sunk cost fallacy applied to war just like everything else. He received reports of atrocities committed by both sides. Coalition forces executing prisoners, Assembly defenders using chemical weapons on their own cities, civilians murdered for their species affiliation. The war had stopped being about freedom or justice. Now it was just about who could endure more horror. Commissioner Brell watched his homeworld burn from orbit, safely aboard a transport preparing to flee to neutral space. He had supported the restrictions on humanity. He had justified the Mars massacre. He had believed the Assembly propaganda about dangerous Deathworlders needing control. Now his people were paying for those decisions. Coalition forces had besieged his homeworld for 2 months. The orbital defenses had fallen last week. Ground forces were fighting through the capital city, while the government collapsed. Everything he had known was ending because the assembly had pushed humanity too far. He made a decision that surprised even himself. He opened a communication channel to Patricia Chen and offered to defect. He had access to assembly command codes, defense protocols, and strategic intelligence. He would provide everything in exchange for clemency for his species. Patricia did not trust him but recognized the value of his information. She accepted with conditions: full cooperation, complete honesty, and testimony at the war crimes trials that would follow. Brell agreed to all of it. He had helped start this war through arrogance and cruelty. The least he could do was help end it. His intelligence allowed coalition forces to bypass several major defenses. Battles that would have taken months were won in weeks. Casualties decreased as tactical information improved. And slowly, painfully, the core worlds fell one by one. High Arbiter Quilven retreated to the Assembly Throne World for a final stand. The planet was a fortress defended by automated systems and fanatic loyalists. Quilven broadcast defiant messages claiming the Assembly would rise again, that Deathworlders would be crushed. That order would be restored. David Walsh led the diplomatic delegation that accompanied the military assault. He wanted to be present when the Assembly finally fell. He needed to see it end with his own eyes. Too many had died for him to watch from a distance. The final assault took 3 days. Coalition forces overwhelmed the defenders through sheer determination and superior tactics. The Throne World's defenses fell section by section, and when coalition troops finally breached the Assembly Council chambers, they found Quilven surrounded by guards refusing to surrender. The standoff lasted 6 hours. Quilven demanded guarantees of safety and political asylum. Patricia refused. This ended with unconditional surrender or death. Quilven chose surrender but continued broadcasting propaganda even as soldiers took him into custody. The war was over. The Assembly government was dissolved. The core worlds were occupied by coalition forces, and the galaxy fell silent as everyone processed what had just happened. 40 billion dead, hundreds of worlds devastated, entire sectors reduced to ruins. The economic damage would take decades to repair. The psychological trauma would last generations, and nobody could claim victory without acknowledging the terrible price paid. Sophie sat in the ruins of Assembly Prime and cried for the first time in 3 years. She had survived. So many had not. Roy Foster, thousands of soldiers she had served with, civilians who had been caught in battles they did not start, children who would never grow up. The cost of freedom was written in blood across half the galaxy. Marcus gathered his surviving troops and tried to find words that would give their sacrifices meaning. Nothing felt adequate. They had fought for freedom and won, but they had also become killers, destroyers, and sometimes monsters. Victory did not erase what they had done or who they had become. Priya compiled casualty reports and felt sick. Human losses totaled 2 billion. Alliance species had lost billions more. Assembly worlds had suffered terribly. And for what? To prove that oppression eventually creates resistance? To show that pushing people too far leads to war? The lesson seemed obvious in retrospect, but civilizations never learned from others' mistakes. They had to make their own, and now everyone would live with the consequences. David stood in the empty assembly chamber where he had once begged for basic dignity. The seats were vacant now. The government was gone, and humanity had burned half the galaxy to achieve what diplomacy could not. He wondered if there had been another way, if more patience or better arguments could have prevented the war, but he knew the truth. The Assembly had never intended to treat humanity as equals. The restrictions would have continued until humanity was eliminated or broken completely. Sometimes violence was the only response to violence. Sometimes burning it all down was the only path to something better. The question now was what came next. Could the survivors build something worth all the death and destruction? Or had they simply cleared ground for the next empire, the next oppression, the next war? David did not have answers. He only had hope, and that felt fragile as glass. 3 years after the war ended, David Walsh walked through the memorial garden on Luna. The monument stretched for kilometers, covered in names of the fallen from every species: human, Saros, Korgath, even Assembly civilians who had died in the fighting. No distinctions between sides here, only recognition that everyone lost something. He touched Roy Foster's name carved in black stone and remembered the man who had refused orders to protect his people. Then he moved on to the next section, and the next, reading names until they blurred together into a testament of shared suffering. The Galactic Federation had been established 18 months ago after difficult negotiations. Every species received equal representation regardless of size or military strength. No species could impose restrictions on another, and most importantly, a charter of universal rights protected everyone from the kind of oppression that had started the war. David had been elected as the first Federation Chancellor. Despite his protests that he was tired and wanted to retire, the other representatives insisted that the human who had fought for freedom through diplomacy before being forced into war was exactly who they needed leading the recovery. The job was harder than fighting had been. Reconstruction efforts drained resources faster than they could be allocated. War crime tribunals tried to balance justice with reconciliation and satisfied nobody. Entire sectors needed food aid because their agricultural capacity had been destroyed, and everyone carried trauma that manifested in anger, fear, and resentment. Patricia Chen had retired from military service immediately after the war ended. She could not look at a warship without remembering the battles and the deaths. Instead, she established a peacekeeping academy that trained officers from all species in defense and disaster response. The academy's motto was simple: strength protects, but cooperation builds. Students learned tactics and strategy alongside conflict resolution and diplomacy. The goal was to create military officers who understood when to fight and when to find alternatives. Sophie Grant taught at the academy now. Her classes focused on small unit tactics and asymmetric warfare, but she always started with a lecture about cost. She showed students footage from the war. She talked about friends who died. She described the nightmares that still woke her up. And she made clear that violence should always be the last option because the price was higher than anyone wanted to pay. Her students called her the Ice Commander because of her controlled demeanor. They did not know she cried herself to sleep some nights. They did not see her hands shake when loud noises reminded her of battles. They only saw the professional warrior who taught them to survive. Marcus Stone had surprised everyone by becoming a builder again. He returned to Europa with a crew of former soldiers and started reconstructing the habitats that had been destroyed. His teams included humans, Sauros, Korgath, and even former assembly species. They worked together in silence at first, then slowly began talking, sharing stories, building friendships. He discovered that creating was harder than destroying, but infinitely more satisfying. Every habitat completed felt like redemption for the buildings he had burned during the war. It would never balance the scales, but it was something positive to hold on to. Priya continued her research into galactic biology, but now she focused on healthcare instead of weapons. She led teams developing treatments for diseases that affected multiple species. Her work on human immune adaptability led to breakthroughs that helped everyone. She had access to all the assembly records now, including the secret files that revealed the depth of their corruption. The restrictions on humanity had been just the most visible part of a system designed to exploit everyone. The assembly had artificially suppressed technology development in some species. They had created economic dependencies that prevented independence. They had even conducted experiments on unwilling populations. The truth was worse than anyone had imagined, which made the war's necessity clearer, but did not ease the guilt about its conduct. Priya published everything, believing that transparency was essential to preventing future abuses. Some species did not want to know how badly they had been manipulated. Others demanded retrials based on new evidence. It was messy and painful but necessary. War Chief Rana led the joint defense force that protected Federation space. She commanded ships and soldiers from 20 different species, united under the principle that threats to any member were threats to all. The force was smaller than the old assembly military, but more effective because everyone chose to be there. Rana had lost 3 of her clan siblings in the war and would never fully recover from that grief. But she found purpose in building something that might prevent future wars. Her philosophy was simple: strength prevented aggression, unity prevented exploitation, and vigilance prevented the rise of another assembly. The war crime tribunals were perhaps the most difficult aspect of reconstruction. Both sides had committed atrocities. Both sides had killed civilians, used prohibited weapons, and violated treaties. Justice required holding everyone accountable, but punishment risked reigniting conflicts. High Arbiter Quilvin faced trial for crimes against humanity and multiple other species. The evidence was overwhelming. Genocide planning, systematic oppression, and ordering attacks on civilians. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Some wanted execution, but the Federation chose to demonstrate that they were better than what came before. Dozens of assembly leaders faced similar trials, but coalition commanders were not exempt. Officers who had committed war crimes during the fighting were also prosecuted. The message was clear. Nobody was above justice, regardless of which side they had fought for. Sophie testified at 3 trials. Once as a witness to the Mars massacre that helped convict the officers responsible. Once as a defendant for executing prisoners during the Battle of Assembly Prime. She was found guilty of lesser charges and received a suspended sentence based on extenuating circumstances. The verdict satisfied nobody, which meant it was probably fair. Commissioner Brell received clemency for his cooperation, but faced civil penalties that left him impoverished and disgraced. He spent his remaining years working in refugee camps, trying to atone for his role in starting the war. Some saw it as justice, others saw it as insufficient. He saw it as penance that would never be enough. David visited Earth regularly despite living on Luna near the Federation headquarters. The homeworld had survived the war relatively intact compared to many worlds, but scars remained. Population was down by half. Economic recovery was slow. And an entire generation had grown up knowing only war and its aftermath. But children were being born into a galaxy where they could dream of futures beyond survival. Schools taught history that included the war, but also emphasized the peace that followed. And slowly, painfully, hope began to replace trauma. He met with students from a dozen species at a university on Earth. They asked about the war, about the decisions he had made, about whether violence had been necessary. He answered honestly. The assembly had left humanity no choice, but the methods used to win had cost everyone their innocence. One young human asked if he regretted the war. David paused for a long time before answering. He regretted the deaths. He regretted the destruction. He regretted the trauma that would last generations. But he did not regret fighting for freedom. Oppression had to be resisted. The only question was how much you were willing to sacrifice. Priya attended the same presentation and added her perspective. The galaxy had nearly destroyed itself, proving something that should have been obvious. Pushing people beyond endurance creates resistance. Denying basic dignity creates rage. And refusing peaceful change makes violent change inevitable. The assembly had feared humanity because humans came from a dangerous world that made them strong. That fear had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. They had oppressed humanity until the Deathworlders snapped, and then discovered that their fears had not been strong enough. Humans were not just dangerous. They were transformative. The war had broken the galaxy, but what was rebuilt was better than what existed before. Species cooperated as equals. Rights were protected universally. And the memory of war's cost made everyone hesitant to repeat the mistake. Sophie found David after the presentation and asked a question she had been carrying for years. Had it been worth it? 40 billion dead to achieve what diplomacy could not. Was freedom worth that price? David had asked himself the same question every day for 3 years. He looked at the students walking across campus representing species that had been enemies during the war. He thought about the Federation replacing the Assembly. He considered the universal rights that protected everyone now. And he gave the only honest answer he had. It should never have cost so much. Better leadership on both sides could have prevented the war. But given what the Assembly was and what they intended for humanity, fighting had been necessary. The price was terrible, but slavery would have cost humanity's soul. At least they had kept that. Sophie accepted the answer without satisfaction. Some questions did not have good answers. They just had truth. The memorial garden on Luna added new names every year as survivors succumbed to injuries or trauma, but it also included a section for the future, blank stone waiting to be carved with the names of those not yet born. The symbolism was deliberate. Remember the cost of war, but do not let it define everything that follows. David returned to that garden often. He would never forget what had been lost, but he would also never stop working to build something worthy of the sacrifice. The Deathworlders had snapped when pushed too far. They had broken the galaxy in the process. And then they had proven that destruction could be followed by creation, if people found the courage to try. The war was over. The peace was fragile, but it was real and it was worth fighting to protect. Not with weapons this time, but with the same determination that had won freedom. The galaxy had learned its lesson written in blood and fire. Now came the harder work of making sure nobody forgot.